I think you all know me, but I'm Janice Sarah. I'm a professor of law at UBC. And this webinar is only for our Canadian climate governance experts. So you're all people that have worked very closely with us. And we are pretty excited about this webinar meeting today. It's actually been quite an exciting week. So I will start off by saying that CCLI has received funding for 3 more years. You'll be getting an announcement tomorrow, but it's very exciting. So you're hearing it fresh off the block, and including hiring a full-time director and communications manager. So please stay tuned tomorrow for that. But the really exciting news, the really substantive news, is today's release of the legal opinion by Carol Hansell. This is the first serious and substantive legal opinion on the obligations of directors and officers in respect of climate change. So it is going to add significantly, I think, to the public policy discussion. For those of you that have agreed to do local media interviews today and tomorrow, thank you very much. And I'm not going to say much more except to briefly introduce our host, Catherine, and Carol. Catherine McCall probably doesn't need much introduction to this group. She's the executive director of the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance. They represent over 53 institutional investors with roughly $4.5 trillion under management. She's going to host today, and she will be posing any questions that you put in the Q&A or comments or observations to Carol. And then, of course, the star of the day, for all of the tremendous amount of work that she has put into this, is Carol Hansell. Carol, of course, is the lead in her firm, Hansell LLP, which is really a firm specializing in advice to corporate boards, senior management, and institutional investors. She's a well-respected member of the Canadian Bar. She teaches fiduciary obligation for the Institute of Corporate Directors, and of course is well known to just about every corporate lawyer or counsel in the country. So with that, I'm going to disappear, and thank you again for participating. And we look forward to using this in our presentations to boards, in our interactions with media, and of course, you're free to use the legal opinion in giving advice to your clients as well in your paid life. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Janice. Well, welcome, Carol. Thank you very much for providing us with this advanced review or view of your new legal opinion, putting climate change risk on the boardroom table, and the opportunity to ask questions of you with this small group. I think it's great, so thank you for that. The opinion itself is comprehensive, it's brilliant, it's a very important opinion, I think, given where we are with climate change, and I think it's going to be very welcome and by shareholders and other stakeholders. And I think it's long overdue. So again, thank you for this excellent piece of work and to your team. I know that speaking for us, the Coalition for Good Governance, we're very happy to have this work out there and to be able to use it as a sort of theoretical underpinning for the work that we do when we engage with boards and we issue policies with regard to the expectations that investors have from directors with respect to environmental, social issues in general, and governance issues and climate change in particular. We, in our directors' environmental and social guidebook, we make it very clear that we think oversight of these sorts of risks are part of the board's responsibility, but to have this in a very strong, very well written, argued legal opinion will be of incredible value for us in our engagement in our corporate governance work going forth. So I had a number of questions I wanted to ask, but I thought you, Carol, could start by giving us your sense of the highlights of what you would like us to, what struck you the most out of your research in drafting this opinion.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to the CCLI, and congratulations to the CCLI on its additional funding. It's an important organization that is doing important work. The additional funding, I know, will carry you a long way, and so I'm very delighted to be part of that. I also wanted to give a brief nod to my team. We've been working on the opinion for almost a year. I've had amazing support. Susan Kushnerek, Eric Morgan, Wesley Cohen, Adam Werha, Tina Lim, Harlan Tufford. So thank you, everyone. We're delighted to be able to share this work with you and to discuss it with you. Let me just go through the highlights, and then we can dig in where we'd like. So the first thing that I think is important to say to directors, probably not to most of you, but to say to directors, is that the fact of climate change and the risks that it poses for the planet have been well researched, they've been well documented, and they have been well publicized. In addition to that, the courts in Canada have taken judicial notice of climate change and the risks it poses. The investment community, as Catherine has noted, has been convinced of and concerned about climate change risks to the organizations in which they invest for many, many years. The investor community is very well resourced in terms of in developing its understanding and being able to critique what its investee companies are doing. So the fact that the global community, central bankers, courts, investors are all convinced of climate change and that it poses risks to the economy and to individual businesses makes it, I think, more than obvious to directors who probably don't need further inquiry than that to accept the premise that climate change is real and it has potential to affect the businesses of the organization the directors serve. So the first part of the paper chronicles a lot of those issues, many of which will be familiar to many of you. We then move into the discussion of the director's duties. From our perspective, this issue engages primarily the duty of care. So we discuss the oversight role, the importance of the board's role in risk management, and then we spend quite a bit of time talking about what the duty of care means in the context of oversight, and in particular in respect of the oversight of climate risk change. We spend some time on the fiduciary duty, mostly to note that directors have the authority to take the interests of stakeholders of the corporation into account and are not bound to simply look at the interests of shareholders, of the corporation. The interests of stakeholders can also be engaged. I know you're all familiar with that concept as well. And then we spend another piece of the paper discussing disclosure obligations, where they come from, why they're important, the frameworks that have been suggested, the importance of the TCFD framework, which Catherine, I'm sure, can speak to as well in connection with the coalition's endorsement of the TCFD. And we talk a little bit about directors' liability. I have to say, we don't tend to come at everything from the perspective that if you don't do this, you'll go to jail. If you don't do this, you'll get fined. So we come at it from the perspective of what the job of the board is, and then highlight the liability issues a bit later on. And then finally, we talk about governance issues. Governance issues or the governance of climate change risk management are mentioned throughout the paper, but we spend a bit of time focusing in particular on the governance tools that are frankly well developed in most boardrooms in any event and simply need to be applied to the issue of climate change risk management. So that is a very brief tour through the paper. Let me just pause there, Catherine, and see if there's anything particular you'd like to dig in on.
One of the things that really interests me is whether there is anything unique about this environmental issue or this particular material risk that warrants a specific look through duty of care or being treated differently, or what is it about climate change, if anything, that is unique?
Yeah, I think the reason it's gotten, so the issue of climate change has obviously had a lot of study from scientists and governments for many years. But starting in about 2015, the financial community started paying much more attention to it. There was quite a well-known speech by Mark Carney when he was the governor of the Bank of England, talking about the impact of climate change on financial stability, and that then rolled into our own expert report that was done by the federal government, chaired by Tiff Macklem, who of course is now the governor of the Bank of Canada. I think the difference between environmental issues, which more broadly put, which continue obviously to be important, and climate change risk, is that climate change risk is happening to everyone. It is impacting people at a variety of different levels. So for example, companies can't just look at what's happening to me. They have to be worried about what's happening to their suppliers, what's happening to their customers. So all of the business partnerships that allow corporations to function are impacted by climate change. So it feels, I think, sometimes to people as though this is a relatively recent issue. The focus on it from a financial stability perspective may be newer, but the fact of climate change risk is not.
Yeah, and I think sorry, had you finished, Carol?
Yes, thank you.
I was also thinking that it's unique in the sense that typically when we do speak about environmental risk for the corporation, and we have spoken about this in the past, we think that it's what is the company doing to the world, what are the environmental risks that they are being subject to, either through regulation or liabilities from communities and through their tail ponds, or they're polluting the local waters. And this is something that it's not what the company is doing. It's the boards have to shift the direction, what's being done to us. Right. And that's the focus. That it's I think it's slightly different, a risk to bring analysis of risk to that. It requires a little different head thinking, I think.
So I don't know if you find this, Catherine, but the concept of CSR, corporate social responsibility, has been around for decades. Mm-hmm. And I think people use terminology differently, but I think generally what people mean by CSR is being good people. So mm-hmm. being virtuous earthlings, being good to the community, participating in the community. So that philosophy can exist for its own benefit. It's just good to be good, or people can tie it into the bottom line, saying being good to the community is a long-term benefit to the organization. But that is not what we're talking about here. Yeah. So, at least from my perspective, when I read people's disclosure and under climate change risk or sustainability, what they're talking about is their volunteer programs or something they're giving in the community, which is important and laudable, but it's not this issue. This issue is what is climate change? How is that changing our world? What are the risks that we are now facing? We may have been facing for a long time, but we are now recognizing what are the risks, and also what are the opportunities? Are there things that we can tap into now? Is there a product that can be sold? Is it easier to? Is there talent that we can recruit? There are a lot of opportunities that come with any negative, and so companies obviously have to tap into that as well.
And does the board's duty of care apply equally to assessing, evaluating, and grabbing those opportunities?
So we generally in the paper, so boards obviously all operate differently, but for the most part, we deal with the board as an oversight body as opposed to a doing body. Mm-hmm. And so that involves delegating risk identification, risk management strategies and so forth, that delegated to management. I think the thing that has probably not either fallen off the table or not quite made it to the table is reporting, is making it a board level issue. So very often you find when you look at somebody's disclosure and then you talk to the management team, it's clear that the management team has been dealing with climate change risk as a part of their normal risk management for some time under various areas of concern. They may not have brought it together even in their own minds. This is all climate change, but they certainly have not presented it to the board in that way. And so it's not necessarily that the corporation isn't doing anything. It just is not on the board agenda in that way.
And there's now the recognition that it needs to reach that level.
Exactly.
And I think if you were the member, a car parts manufacturing company, and the future was electric cars, that it should cross the boards.
Right.
plate as well, that the opportunities are going to be different for them, and that's something that they would also have
Exactly.
to be
That's
responsible
exactly
for.
right.
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking is when we talk about terms of climate change being something that hits us from companies from the outside, is very analogous to COVID, which is hit us from the outside, not responsible for anything we did. But in the case of climate risk, everybody's a little bit responsible for what's happened. But the answers to what you do, I think, are going to be similar. How you act, it has to be collective action.
Right.
You know, it's very
Exactly.
collective action. So maybe I understand what you were talking about earlier about the fiduciary duty and climate, but I'm interested in what happens to the fiduciary duty aspect of acting in the best interest with respect to climate change. And you focus on the duty of care in particular. Why is that?
Well, I think the fiduciary duty has been quite extensively covered in two Supreme Court of Canada decisions. And so I think we're clear in Canada that directors owe their fiduciary duty to the corporation, but that they can take into account the interests of other stakeholders. To date, the only stakeholders that have really been in play are creditors and shareholders, so the people who provide the capital to the corporation. But there has been I think, an effort to push back on that, at least academically and potentially in litigation, to try to broaden that group, most obviously, I think, to employees. So is there a duty that is owed to, do the interests of employees rise to the same level as the interests of creditors or shareholders? And close behind that is the community. And so the Supreme Court did not limit the stakeholders whose interests could be taken into account to creditors and shareholders. It's simply those are the stakeholders whose interests have been under consideration. I think the more difficult concept is the statements that have been made by the Supreme Court, both in Peoples and in BCE, about the duty of care not being closed to just the corporation. So that's a more difficult issue, because the Supreme Court in both cases made the point, didn't spend as much time as you might like discussing it, but made it clear that if a stakeholder could make out a claim in tort, for example, that the duty of care against the directors, the duty of care against which they would be measured is the statutory duty of care in the corporate statute.
Right.
So that leaves open the possibility. Separately, you would have to figure out how to make out the case in tort against directors or against officers. And we know that the courts have been reluctant to assign tort liability to directors simply on the basis that they're directors if they've had no direct involvement in a matter. But it's not I don't think it's a closed issue.
So the way, when we are meeting with the experts from the CCLI, or meeting with our directors, the strongest way into their minds, I guess you'd say, or their consciousness, is to deal with them at the duty of care that they have with respect to that's something that is well understood, and that they,
Exactly. And so the duty of care, I think, it isn't actually, although we spent quite a lot of time trying to pull the various pieces of it apart, it's not really that complicated a concept. I think that the important thing for people to bear in mind with the duty of care is that the test is objective. It's not subjective. It's not, the fiduciary duty is a subjective test. What were my motivations for doing something? The duty of care is an objective standard and measured against what a reasonably prudent person would do. So the care, diligence, skill at a reasonable,
And the only, as I understand it, the only subjectivity comes in that is if you are a reasonable person that happens to be much more skilled in the science of climate change or auditing, then that's a slightly different standard, because that's what you bring to the table.
So right? It's interesting, I never look at that as a separate standard. So there is one standard, care, diligence, and skill of a reason, but a reasonably prudent person would apply the skills that they have.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that there are any, you say in your opinion that the corporate governance structures are there to deal with climate change risk? Do you have any think that there are anything unique that this issue is going to bring up in terms of board structure or board needs or processes because of its nature of being systemic, long-term, any of that, or boards have what they need, the tools they need?
I think the governance processes and structures are there. I think it's understanding it. I think it's just taking the lens to whether it's committee structures or compensation or whatever tools directors have in their toolbox, some of which we've outlined, and looking at climate change and saying, well, here's what we understand about the climate change risk that's facing this organization, and how then do we take it into account? So it's not necessarily the case that every organization has material climate change risks, of course.
Right, no.
But people have to conclude that based on it. That's got to be an informed judgment, just not your own sense that, geez, I don't really believe in climate change.
Yeah, and that's another reason I think that TCFD is
Exactly.
such a good framework, because it has the different categories of, whether it's material or not. Sometimes it matters, but whether you're asking the first question, does it matter to us? That's across the board. Every board has to examine that question.
Right, and the TCFD, I think, Catherine, you mentioned yesterday that the coalition has now endorsed.
Yes, we have. Just last week, our board decided to endorse the TCFD, so we're really very happy about that, and I think it's important, and we hope it provides additional guidance, because there is so much noise out there about which standards to use. I think TCFD and SASB are emerging as the standards, and I think it's very important to kind of help move that process along. They're international standards at this point, so right. I think it was important. And I'm assuming that boards, under the way you view boards' responsibilities, under your opinion, is that they have a responsibility to be informed about these sorts of disclosures and to be committed to some well thought out use of some framework or some standards metrics.
Yeah, I mean, people have devoted a lot of resources to developing these frameworks. So there's no legal requirement, obviously, for anybody to adopt SASB or TCFD or GRI or any of the rest of those things. But they're tools that people should be aware of, and recognizing that when you talk to investors about your approach to climate change risk management, an knowledgeable investor is likely to ask questions that are based on the TCFD framework. And so I think everybody's happier if we're in a space where there's a common standard.
I think that, I think that's absolutely right. And it doesn't have to be the only one, but it's better. And I think,
exactly.
Investors owe it to issuers to have that, to get behind a common standard, because you hear so often that from issuers that they don't know what investors want, and investors, we need to make the step, I think.
I think that's right, Catherine. We note in the paper that boards shouldn't really need interpreters to understand what the investors want. I mean, I think you've been pretty clear in the investment community.
Yes.
About wanting disclosure, and now with the added progress of coming around a common framework, that's very helpful.
Yes, we're hoping so. I think that we do often hear that investors aren't as clear as issuers would like us to be about what we're looking for in terms of disclosure, because you might have the responsible investing people from the institution asking for certain things in the portfolio, and there's not. So we do hear that quite a bit. I had a question here. I wondered if you could elaborate what you think boards should do as a matter of corporate governance
with climate change risk.
Yes.
So the two big areas that are easy to point to at a board level is risk and strategy. So you can't develop a strategy without understanding your risks, and so that needs to be built into the strategic planning process. If you think you're going from here to here in 5 years or in 10 years, the issue would be, how is climate change going to help us or stop us from reaching our objectives? In terms of, so there's a lot that the board can do, including getting from those, from the broad topics of risk and management, I think everybody appreciates that risk and risk and strategy need to be on the board agenda regularly.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the board management assess climate risk or some aspect of climate change to be a significant risk to the organization, then you would monitor that on an ongoing basis. Another, I think, consideration is where it belongs in the committee mandates. So if the corporation, for example, has adopted a strategy or an objective that is based around climate change risk, the compensation committee, for example, might look at how can we incentivize management to achieve that specific objective. So does it rise to the level of being taken into account in the metrics of compensation? That would be another example. I think it is, every time we go through one of these issues, whether it was Y2K or cybersecurity or COVID-19, there's always a question about whether you need specialized directors on the board to help deal with the issues. And I think for a lot of people, the idea of getting subject-specific people or subject matter experts has given way to people who have a broader management experience, which includes having dealt with some aspect of this. So whether you actually need a scientist on the board, for example, depending
is
on
questionable. I think it was Exxon that had appointed, was it Exxon or Shell a few years ago that appointed a person with that precise set of expertise, but it didn't
in that industry
stand them in
maybe.
good stead. It didn't work in avoiding other shareholder proposals. And I think you are better to have an intelligent board that is capable of being educated and understands the industry and can look around at and become an expert to the extent necessary is just as important, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And so an expert in the context of this company. So if you accept the fact that the current board doesn't have any specialized knowledge in that particular area of risk, then it's really an issue of building up that awareness at the board level, not through high level, here's a dinner speech about climate change kinds of things, but really digging in deep to the organization and having either members of management who are deeply immersed in the issue, or consultants who actually know your business, explaining to the directors exactly what the problem is.
Given that, you, in your opinion, you talk a lot about climate change being recognized by the courts, being obviously recognized by the science, it's there, it's undeniable, and it's not a matter of whether a director can choose or not to choose and believe in it. What about a director that doesn't believe in it? Does he have a right? Should he be on any board at this point? Is that?
Yeah, well.
He or she. Pardon me.
He or she. So I think there certainly are directors who think that the alarm bells about climate change are a lot of the discussion is exaggerated, or it's not so imminent, or it's not something that needs to be dealt with that quickly. People's personally held views are important, but that's the point of the duty of care, is that you can't just say, here's my perspective and I don't care what you say. Which is, I think, the attitude you're kind of suggesting, that here's my personal view. I don't want any more evidence.
Yeah, I guess it would be that, and I cannot be educated. Then I would say,
well,
logically, then they can't be on the board, I think.
Yeah, you would wonder, you'd wonder what the contribution is.
Yes.
If that's their perspective, because obviously the business of the corporation and the challenges it faces continues to evolve. Even if you get a picture perfect director right out of the box at one annual meeting, typically people stay on the board for a number of years, and they need to keep up with what's going on in the corporation.
Yeah, I have another question here about the relationship between the director's duty of care and the duty of disclosure. Do you have any thoughts on?
So the duty of, I think generally speaking, compliance with legal requirements is part of the job of the board. The job needs to, so that's one point. I think it is clear from the Danier case that disclosure is a legal issue, not a business judgment issue.
Mm-hmm.
So a court
Right.
will, and so that's the piece of it, I think, on the disclosure director's duty side of things. I think that's the piece of it that people sometimes miss, that if you have a judgment, you have a view that this is not material and doesn't need to be disclosed. The disclosure requirement, the requirement to disclose material information, is a legal requirement. If you're wrong, it is not a defense to say, well, that was my judgment. The court will still look at the statute and say, yeah, well, your judgment was wrong. You're in breach.
Mm-hmm.
So the disclosure piece of things is a bit, I think, a bit more challenging for boards than they might appreciate. People are familiar with the prospectus liability and continuous disclosure liability, but I think they're not as well, they're not as aware of the fact that the business judgment rule won't apply to those decisions as they might be.
So what do you think directors should now be, with this opinion out there, apart from reading it, what do they need to do? What do they need to educate themselves? Do they need to?
Yeah, I think they need to, well, if I were taking the entire piece on for a board, what I would be talking about is, so first of all, is climate change an actual risk? And how are you satisfying yourselves about that? So that it doesn't make a lot of sense to build in a lot of governance processes if you don't actually have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you need to reach some determination of where climate risk fits in your risk register. Let's just assume that there are material issues arising in connection with climate change. Then I think plugging it into risk reporting to the board, into the strategic planning process, deciding what kinds of reports need to come regularly to the board. It's always important for boards to continue to review with management the information that they're getting, because sometimes an issue has gone on and on and on, and it needs a different touch at a different period of time. You either need to amp it up or it's now being handled. And so I think boards, you can't just, it's not advisable to simply say, well, this is the way we're going to deal with it forever. It needs to be a constant, constantly refreshed. That's a very good job for the governance committee. Right. So I would take a look at where based on the risk that's been, the risk and the materiality of the risk that's been determined, figure out where it fits in the work of the board and how the board is interacting with management. So putting reporting systems in place. So this will all sound familiar to people because it's what, those are recommended governance practices for a lot of things. You just have to put the climate change risk lens on.
Are you aware of any other country or jurisdiction that has this clear statement on climate change and fiduciary duty of directors?
Well, I think that there was a very good opinion on Australia.
In the Australian, okay.
Yeah, I think it came out kind of in two waves, and so the second, the revision or the update to the opinion came after quite a bit more knowledge about climate change had been shared internationally, and so I think that is also a very strong opinion.
Yeah, because I think this is again to the importance of this opinion, because I think it's been necessary. It's necessary globally, and I think we should do everything we can to disseminate it globally. Through the ICGN and everywhere else that's possible. I think it's going to have a big impact.
Oh, good.
I'm just looking at another question here. Could you comment on the recent initiative of U.S. Labor Secretary Scalias, who intends to pass regulations preventing U.S. pension plans from making investments based on ESG considerations, including climate change?
Well, it seems people are going in different directions. Of course, our expert panel in Canada recommended that the government make it clear that fiduciaries, so pension funds, are not in breach of their fiduciary duty by taking climate change risk into account. So it may be a difference in political direction, or a difference in national philosophy, but I don't think that perspective would hold here.
I can't see it holding either. It seems very much of a politically focused viewpoint. But
Right.
it's interesting, yeah. It's interesting to see the way different people are handling this different, what seems
Well,
obvious to some.
Yeah, it's the old philosophy, I think, of corporations are there to make a profit for their shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a public policy concern, then regulate them.
Yeah.
And I think where things have gone certainly in other parts of the world well ahead of Canada, but Canada more than the United States, is, look, we are all members of society. And although as I said before, the investor perspective is tell me how this is impacting the company. I think the broader philosophy is to make sure that we are solving these problems and enabling people to solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
And the capital markets are just critical to making policy changes at a corporate level.
Yeah, I'm going to just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions from the audience. Anybody have anything that they would like to ask Carol about the opinion? Seems not. I would like to ask you then about your own view and whether it's impacted or not by this opinion on stakeholder capitalism, very broad, I know, and shareholder capitalism, and whether climate change being the unique, all-encompassing, long-term, short-term, mid-term, unknowable and known event that it is that going to have any impact on our which way we swing with the stakeholder or the shareholder, or stay with the shareholder primacy?
Well, I think we have already moved quite a distance. So in Canada.
We have, but one of the reasons I ask is my own concern is that you have, with traditional shareholder primacy theory, you have a governance framework of accountability. When you have stakeholder accountability, you don't have that same framework set up yet. So if boards are accountable to all the many sets of stakeholders, who is holding the board accountable? Because it can't be those. And yeah, that's one of the things that I think is a bit of an issue.
Yeah, no, it's complicated. If shareholders are the ones that are putting people on the board, it's not, directors are accountable to shareholders in the sense that, they're the ones that will decide whether they stay or not.
Yeah.
So how stakeholders can actually have that kind of an impact on an organization, could be in a variety of different ways. I mean, there are representative boards in other countries.
Yes, employee representatives. Because the one thing that would concern me is that if the boards are not accountable to anyone, then it's a nice theory, but it means that boards are basically can be unchecked. Not that they have a fiduciary obligation, but no one can hold them to account. And a lot of, that's.
So I think we can that's a really interesting issue to look at, Catherine. There are lots of organizations that feel an accountability because of some kind of a relationship. So even organizations that are regulated, even though their board is not selected by the regulator or by the government, have a clear accountability.
Yeah.
There is an accountability in a lot of unionized settings.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a relevant issue. I think there is an accountability on the part of lots of organizations to their consumer base, because their consumer base has a very strong reaction to things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it's just we're just at the beginning of this discussion,
exactly.
Because I think it's very, very interesting how it's got a lot of it, if you read Larry Fink's letter, sort of verges on towards what in Canada we would consider to be government under the rubric rather than private.
Right.
It's
exactly.
very different social purpose, and what you're doing with healthcare and whatever is stepping up in that. But I have another question here I wanted to ask. What are your thoughts on issuing public statements, positions on climate change?
On who issuing them?
I'll read it again. What are your thoughts on issuing public statements, positions on climate change? I'm not sure that.
So if by that we mean the corporation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, wait. What are boards? Sorry. What are? Hold on. Sorry about this. I've got, I think, an extra. I think it. What? I think that the question. There's two parts here. I think it means boards that are increasing demands for boards to articulate a clear position on key sustainability issues like climate change. I think that's maybe what the goal.
Well, I think as with any statement, I think it's I think everybody in the corporation needs to be singing from the same song sheet. And so if there are public statements being made about climate change, then I think organizationally, you need to get together, understand who's making the statement, and why it's being made and where it's being made and so forth. So, the disclosure is I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but there's obviously opportunity in the ongoing disclosure to make those kinds of statements, but a declaration about how the corporation feels about or is dealing with climate change risk. The question I would ask the corporation is, who's your audience and what are you trying to make the message?
Right. I have another question here, Carol. If we look at the Oslo Principles on Global Climate Change Obligations, do you think that directors will be held accountable as we saw with asbestos companies?
Well, I think that this is a very, very, very long road. And so I think the law is ever changing. And so I think it's entirely possible that we could get to the point where somebody could make out either it's regulated or could make out a claim in tort, for example, that they've been harmed in some way by the conduct of the directors. That's new. So we don't yet have any case law where people have successfully sued directors for the way in which they've dealt with. So organizations have certainly been sued, and including for their disclosure, and the role of the board has come up in those contexts. But suing directors personally, not yet. I would say the courts have been pretty reluctant to hold directors personally liable just by virtue of being directors. But that could also be subject to social change.
Yeah. Just going back to our earlier conversation, there's a question here. Certainly the courts have moved into stakeholder views, but do you think that boards are actually being advised regarding stakeholder accountability?
I think at the end, my impression, so if I'm in the boardroom, they are, but
okay.
So when there's a lawyer in the room, it's often me, but I think that when push really comes to shove, I think it's the shareholder value issue that continues to be the main point. Assuming you're on side all of your creditor obligations and so forth. I don't know how far away we've drifted from enhancement of shareholder value as being the.
I think where we've come is that we have a much broader or better informed understanding what shareholder value is, and that's going to incorporate how the employees, how are the suppliers, because we realize that if sustainable value is going to be there, that all of these players have to be taken care of, as addressed as well.
Right.
And another question here, Carol. Can you comment on best practice in governance in both considering and disclosing climate change transition risk? Physical and regulatory litigation risk appear to be more straightforward. So transition risk.
Well, again, it would depend on the industry, and you need to figure out, what is it? So if we're transitioning from a carbon perspective, I assume is the underlying question.
Right.
Yeah.
What that transition would mean for your particular business. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's what I think you need to measure. I think transition risk, I agree with the question that transition risk is much less discussed, because it seems to be, I think the perspective may be that it's more of all of climate change is external to the organization. But that is kind of a more broadly known, not necessarily something the company needs to disclose, but that of course is ignores the fact that the company needs to be talking about the way in which it believes that the transition is going to impact its own business.
So basically using the same principles as you would use for any.
Yeah, it's hard to tell people what to do with a risk unless you know what the climate change risk is. A big topic.
Yeah,
so you need to bring it down to, what is it we're trying to do and what's going to stop us.
I'm just looking. See if I have a couple more questions here. I don't think so. So I thought maybe, you would like to say some concluding remarks about what you think you're hoping people will take out of your paper, your opinion?
Yeah,
and I know what I'm hoping. I hope everybody reads.
So I think the core issues for people to take from this, so the overriding theme is that directors do have a duty to put climate change risk on the agenda. I think that's not a very tough conclusion to come to. I think you could say that of any risk, provided that you could also say that it should be apparent to the directors that risk exists. So all of the body of science and international commentary, central bank initiatives, expert panels and so forth, all of that learning coming together, I think makes it unavoidable for directors to say, oh no, I recognize that climate change is out there. I think you then have to, I think what we need to do is turn directors from, well, if it's not my board package, it obviously isn't an issue. Again, there may be a couple of reasons that it's, that's not your board package. It could be that management has never heard of climate change risk, which seems to be unlikely. It is likely in many organizations that management is dealing with the issue, but has not thought of it as a board level issue, or they're aware of it, not dealing with it. Any of those things should cause the board to say, look, we need to let's start out with a briefing on this and figure out where we're gonna go on. So management and the board need to be talking about climate change risk. The duty of care, I think, is the overriding issue here. I don't think it's really a fiduciary duty issue. I think the concern is making sure that directors are discharging their oversight function properly. I mean, it all sounds very rote by the time you come down to it, but the law hasn't changed on the issue. I think we're trying to clarify the law in the context of this particular issue, but the duty of care is quite clearly engaged. Directors have insurance for duty of care. They need to make sure that their insurance covers issues that could relate to climate change. It may not, for example, when it comes to securities litigation. So it could be a disclosure problem. So they need to look at their insurance. They need to look at their indemnities. So there's a whole world of things that need to be kind of reevaluated in the context of looking at a particular type of risk. So I think getting the directors less focused on what's already in their board package on climate change risk, and focusing more on what should be in their board package is ultimately the message we're trying to deliver.
Do you think, slightly different, that fiduciary duty and duty of care is an evolving concept, or it's just as we understand, as the world changes, the concepts are still there and they're malleable and they can fit whatever?
Yeah, I think that the law is ever changing. So the duty of care, I think if there are a lot of reasons people read Peoples and BCE. If you go back and read it for their comments on the duty of care, they're a little surprising, I think. So
I'll have to read them again.
Yeah. So the open nature is saying that the potential beneficiaries of the director's duty of care is not a closed category. That's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, and you bring that up in your opinion.
Right. So I mentioned at the beginning that Justice Brown is a integral member of our team, and we spent a lot of time working through the duty of care with him, and I think we're all satisfied that that category of things, although it's not yet clear what could be made out of the statements of the Supreme Court, there certainly is some room.
Okay. I have another question here. It's a very interesting one. If a decision cannot be attributed to a rational business purpose, if directors have made an unintelligent or unadvised judgment, or if they have otherwise been unduly passive, the courts will not defer to the judgment of the directors. Boards must engage in a reasoned analysis before making decisions, quote unquote. Can you clarify your thoughts on whether this speaks to A, the process in which a decision is made, that is the formal process, or B, also the outcome of the process, that is substantive outcome? And I can read this again. If B, what case would you rely on?
Well, I think the first part of that quote, it's footnoted in the paper. I've forgotten what the Canadian case was, but it's quoting from the Disney decision. Okay. So
it's page 17 on the document. Yeah, I can check.
So the question is whether it goes to process or outcome. The process is important. So how will you demonstrate that it's been a properly informed judgment? So there's a lot of, that's why we document. But when you get to the end of it, and there is just no way that this is even within the realm of being reasonable, the court is not going to defer to the business judgment of the directors. And that the case that I always like the best on that topic is the REPAP case, which is a compensation case. And the directors really took very little notice of what was in the compensation contract that they were signing. And somebody who had been a board member for 9 months when he was ousted in a shareholder battle, was entitled to $27 million under the contract. And so the reasoning of the court was that you can only shelter behind the business judgment rule to the extent that you exercise any business judgment. And she found that they hadn't in that case. So it wouldn't have mattered. So there were minutes of meetings and revisions to documents and so on and so on and so on. But the directors didn't really understand what was in the contract. And the court, they didn't rely in good faith on expert evidence. The process was tilted. It was not an independent process. And so the court would not defer to the business judgment of the directors because they didn't exercise any.
Very sensible. Well, I have no more questions. Everybody have, oh, there's one more question. Thank you both very much. Such good insight, and great if you could share the recording. So we'll look into doing that. But I wanted to thank you very much, Carol, for this. This is great, important work, and it's very exciting. And I think all of us so-called experts, climate experts, are really going to be able to rely on it and get good use out of it. And I know at the coalition, it's going to be very, very meaningful to us to have this resource. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kath.
Thank you to Janice and Joel. Bye all.